The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of old dust and something else I couldn't place, a kind of damp, metallic scent. It was late, maybe a little past 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in late October. I was 23, living alone for the first time in my life in this ancient, four-story walk-up building on the outskirts of Boston. My apartment was a tiny shoebox on the third floor, with a single window overlooking an alleyway filled with overflowing dumpsters and fire escapes that looked like they hadn't been used in a century. My life back then was pretty simple. I worked as a barista at a small, independent coffee shop, spent my free time reading old horror novels, and was trying to save up enough money to get a cat. It was a good time, a quiet time. Nothing ever happened, and that was exactly how I liked it. I had no idea that was all about to change, and that the quiet I treasured so much would soon be replaced by a silence so profound it would make my ears ring. The whole thing started with a flicker. I was curled up on my thrift store couch, completely engrossed in a Stephen King book, when the lights above me flickered once, then twice, and died. Total, absolute darkness. I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight, but the battery was at 3%, and I knew it wouldn't last. A wave of irritation washed over me. I was a person who was always prepared for everything, but for some reason, I hadn't thought about candles. It was a dumb mistake, and I knew it. The only light I had was a single match I found in an old kitchen drawer, so I lit it, and its tiny flame cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making my familiar apartment feel foreign and menacing. It was a blackout, and the quiet that followed was the first thing that really got to me. It wasn't a normal silence. It was a kind of smothering quiet, like the whole world had just held its breath. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, and a shiver ran down my spine, a deep, unsettling feeling that went beyond just the cold. I knew I needed candles, and I knew the only person who might have them was my neighbor on the second floor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. I blew out the match and decided to go. I didn't know then that I was walking right into a nightmare. The stairwell was an abyss. The building had no emergency lights, and the only sliver of illumination came from the streetlights filtering in through the grimy, opaque windows on the landings. It was just enough to make out the silhouette of the banister and the steps, but not enough to see anything else. I gripped the wooden railing, smooth from decades of hands running over it, and started my descent. My sneakers squeaked against the slick linoleum of the third-floor landing, the sound echoing strangely in the dead air. I took a step down, then another and another. My own breathing was loud in my ears, a nervous, shallow sound. Every sound was magnified. The groaning of the ancient building settling, the distant hum of a car on the street, the unsettling creak of a floorboard somewhere above me. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, saturated with every tiny, amplified noise, and it was getting under my skin as I reached the second-to-last flight of stairs. Heading for Mrs. Gable's door, I heard it. A rustling sound, like someone dragging a heavy coat across the concrete wall. I froze, my hand still on the railing. I held my breath, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just the ringing silence. I convinced myself it was just the building, maybe a mouse in the walls, and started to move again. That's when I heard it for the second time, but this time it was different. It wasn't a rustle, it was a soft, guttural breathing, ragged and wet, coming from somewhere just below me. It sounded like it was struggling for air, like it had just run a marathon. It was close, too close. My heart started pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body rigid with fear, and whispered, "Hello." There was no reply. I didn't know what I was looking at or listening to, but it wasn't human. It was something else that I stood there, frozen solid, my heart a frantic hummingbird in my chest. The breathing came again. Oh, it was slower this time, but it was definitely moving. I could hear it coming up the last few steps from the second-floor landing, the sound getting louder with each soft, dragging shuffle. A cold dread, colder than the October air, seeped into my bones. I tried to reason with myself, to find any logical explanation. Maybe it was just old Mr. Henderson from the first floor, struggling with his asthma. I called out again, my voice shaking this time. "Mr. Henderson? Is that you?" The silence that followed was so absolute. It was even worse than the breathing. It was a refusal to respond, a deliberate choice. That's when I felt it. A wisp of icy air, a touch like a spiderweb brushing the back of my neck. The cold feeling lingered, a ghostly touch that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just cold air, it felt like a presence, right there behind me. My brain was screaming for me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. A primal, fight-or-flight response that had decided to go with none of the above. And then it happened. I heard a sound, a dry, papery whisper, so close it felt like someone was speaking directly into my ear canal. The words were a jumble of syllables I'd never heard before. Not English, not Spanish, not anything human. It was a guttural, clicking language, like pebbles rattling in a dry throat. In that moment, all the logic and rational thought I had a second ago completely shattered. I didn't think, I just reacted. I spun around, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream, and started scrambling back up the stairs. And as I did, I heard it, the heavy, purposeful footsteps beginning their own climb, following my panicked retreat. They were slow, deliberate, and somehow, they were right on my heels. My legs were burning, but I didn't stop. I scrambled up the stairs two at a time, my sneakers making soft, desperate squeaks against the linoleum. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that distorted all sense of space and direction. I was just a blind, panicked animal, relying on muscle memory and a primal need to get away. The only sounds were my own ragged, heaving breaths and the thumping of my heart in my ears. But beneath all that, a methodical rhythm cut through the chaos. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy footsteps of whatever it was, climbing after me. It wasn't running. It wasn't even hurrying. It was a slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly patient pace, as if it knew exactly where I was and that I couldn't escape. It was the sound of a predator enjoying the hunt that I finally felt the turn, the subtle shift in the floor that told me I was on the third-floor landing. My apartment door was just a few feet away, a solid, wooden barrier that represented my only hope of survival. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the cold metal in my pocket. The footsteps were on the landing now. I could hear the distinct sound of its weight shifting, a low, groaning rumble that resonated through the floorboards. It was so close, I could practically feel the warmth of its breath, the same ragged, wet sound I'd heard on the stairs. I jammed the key into the lock, my first attempt missing completely. My entire body tensed, a silent scream building in my throat. I couldn't let it touch me. I didn't want to know what it felt like. My shaking fingers finally found the lock, and the key scraped its way home. The small, metallic click felt like a cannon shot in the oppressive silence. As I twisted the doorknob, I felt it. A cold, dry touch on my back, a sensation like papery skin. It was so unexpected and so horrifying that a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped my lips. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of that touch was enough. It was long and thin, with the unmistakable texture of something that had been dead for a very, very long time. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me, and I shoved the door open with a sob, stumbling into the black void of my apartment and falling forward onto my hands and knees that I didn't even think. I just scrambled backward, pulling the door shut with a loud, final bang that echoed through my apartment. I fumbled for the deadbolt, and with a trembling hand, I shoved it home. Click. My back was pressed against the cold wood of the door, and I was sliding down to the floor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The silence was back, but it was shattered a moment later by a new sound. A long, scratching scrape, like claws on wood, came from the other side of the door. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, up and down the door, as if whatever was out there was tracing the outline of the door, marking its territory. I was trapped inside my small apartment, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I was not alone. It was still out there, and it was watching. My body was coiled so tight with terror, I thought my muscles would snap. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, deliberate carving that made my blood run cold. It was a sound of ownership, as if it was claiming this space. I pressed my ear to the door, listening to it move up and down, up and down. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the scratching. I didn't know if it had left, or if it was just standing there, a silent specter, listening, waiting for me to make a move. I was drenched in sweat, my clothes sticking to my skin. I needed a light, something to break the suffocating darkness and confirm I was truly alone inside my apartment. My phone was dead. I remembered the old matches I'd used earlier, still in the kitchen. It was a small hope, a tiny flicker against a terrifying abyss, and I knew I had to take it. I got to my feet slowly, trying not to make a sound, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My hands were outstretched, feeling my way through the familiar space that now felt alien and hostile. The air was thick and cold, and I could feel the hairs on my arms prickle, the same icy sensation from the stairwell. It was a ghostly, static electricity that made my skin crawl. I crept to the kitchen counter, my fingers brushing against the cold porcelain of a coffee mug before finding the drawer handle. I pulled it open as slowly as possible, the soft rattle of the silverware inside sounding like a symphony of noise. My fingers finally closed around a small, cardboard box. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. I heard something from the living room, a soft, dry shuffling sound. It was inside my apartment. With me, I froze, clutching the matchbox with trembling fingers. The shuffling sound was now accompanied by a soft, scraping rustle, like something dragging itself across the wooden floor. It was moving toward me. My heart was in my throat, but I knew I had to see. I had to know what was in my apartment. I took a single match and, with a shaky hand, struck it against the side of the box. The tiny flames sputtered to life, casting a weak, dancing light that barely reached the middle of my living room. But it was enough. Just enough. The light fell on a figure hunched in the center of the room, a gangly, stick-thin humanoid with long, disproportionate limbs that ended in impossibly long, skeletal fingers. Its skin was pale and translucent, and where its eyes should have been were just empty, dark sockets. It wasn't looking at me with its face. It was just a presence, a quiet, motionless horror. The breathing from the stairwell now made sense. It was a series of small, gill-like slits on its neck that pulsed in and out with a wet, raspy sound. The whisper was the dry, papery scraping of its fingers on the floor. The match burned down, the heat suddenly searing my fingertips, and with a hiss of pain, I dropped it. The darkness returned, but now it was filled with the afterimage of that thing. Its horrible form burned into my mind. The shuffling stopped. The breathing stopped. Everything was completely still. I waited and waited for what felt like an eternity. I don't know why it stopped. Maybe the light scared it, or the sudden touch of the fire. I just know that for the rest of the night, I sat there, curled up in a ball in the corner of my kitchen, with my back to the wall, and nothing else happened. I sat there until the sun finally came up, a slow, agonizing crawl of light through the grimy window. The moment the first sliver of daylight hit my apartment, the air instantly felt different. The oppressive cold was gone. The normal sounds of the city came back, a distant bus, a car horn, a garbage truck. It was over. I opened the door to the hallway, half expecting to see scratch marks, but there were none. Nothing. It was like it had never happened. But I knew. I packed my bags that afternoon, left a note for my landlord, and never went back. I still don't know what it was or why it was in my building, but I know one thing for sure. Some silences aren't empty. They're just waiting for a sound to make a move. The whole thing happened about 5 years ago, back when I was a student, a young designer barely scraping by. My life back then was pretty simple. Work, classes, then straight back to my tiny one-bedroom apartment on the west side of town. The place was nothing special, just a boxy little space with a single window overlooking a brick wall, but it was mine. I'd spent weeks meticulously arranging it, creating a little sanctuary. My vintage armchair, a thrift store find I'd lovingly reupholstered, was my pride and joy. It sat right by the tiny kitchen table, a perfect spot for my morning coffee. My days were a predictable cycle of design projects and lectures. The only thing that ever broke the routine was the frequent power outages that plagued our neighborhood. The old grid couldn't handle the heat, so every time a summer storm rolled in, we'd all be plunged into darkness. We were so used to it that nobody even flinched anymore. It was just a part of living there. It was a Tuesday, a hot, humid evening after a particularly draining day. I remember the air was thick, heavy, like a wet blanket, and the sky was a bruised purple and gray. I'd just unlocked my door, dropped my bag, and kicked off my shoes when the lights went out. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The hum of the fridge and the faint city noise suddenly gone. I sighed, muttering to myself about the old grid again. I reached for my phone, planning to use the flashlight, but the battery was nearly dead, just a sliver of red flickering at the bottom of the screen. I wasn't worried, though. I knew exactly where the emergency candles were, in the kitchen cabinet, right next to the pots and pans. I took a step, and that's when I felt it. The space around me felt wrong. It wasn't a gut feeling or a premonition. It was a physical thing. My foot hit something hard and unyielding that shouldn't have been there. I fumbled in the dark, my fingers tracing the familiar carved wood of my vintage armchair. Only, it wasn't by the kitchen table. It was right in the middle of the narrow hallway, blocking my path. My heart started to do this nervous little flutter in my chest. It felt wrong, terribly wrong that a sudden chill snaked up my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the humid air. I brushed it off, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe I'd pushed the chair when I came in. No, that was ridiculous. I'd walked in, dropped my bag, and the chair was solid wood, not something you accidentally nudge a few feet. My phone's screen flickered, a tiny pulse of light, and I used it to scan the floor. And that's when I saw it. The small, ornate ceramic lamp from my bedside table was lying on its side, a few feet from the chair. It was a subtle, almost innocent-looking detail, but in the dark, in that quiet apartment, it felt like a deliberate act, like a message. My heart was pounding now, a frantic drum against my ribs. It wasn't just a blackout anymore. Something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. It felt like I'd just stepped into a different version of my home, a distorted, uncanny reflection of the one I'd left that morning that I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the absurdity. Had someone broken in? But why move my furniture? It didn't make sense. I could feel the clammy sweat on my palms as I fumbled for my phone again, the screen a faint, dying glow. I pointed it toward the living room, praying to see nothing, to prove my eyes were playing tricks on me. Instead, the dim light revealed a scene that made my blood run cold. My small coffee table, the one that usually sat in front of the sofa, was now positioned in the middle of the room. My floor cushions were scattered, creating a bizarre, winding path leading from the coffee table towards the bedroom hallway. It was too intentional, too carefully orchestrated to be a coincidence. It wasn't the chaos of a burglary. It was the chilling precision of a setup. The last object in this twisted trail was the framed photo of my face, the one I had taken a few months before, sitting neatly at the threshold of my bedroom door, as if someone was marking my route in the dark and waiting to see if I'd follow it. That photo. It wasn't just a picture. It was a close-up I'd taken of my own face on a rare good hair day. My smile was wide, a little crooked, and my eyes were sparkling. Seeing it there, propped up like a monument at the entrance to my bedroom, felt like a violation on a level I couldn't even begin to process. It wasn't just that someone had been in my home. They had studied me. They had looked at me. It felt like they knew me. The air grew impossibly heavy, the silence now a suffocating presence. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my own terrified heartbeat pulsing in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to be a nightmare, a trick of the light and the darkness. But when I opened them, my phone's battery finally gave up, the screen going black, and I was plunged into total, absolute blackness. The darkness was a living thing. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The only sound was the frantic thump 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 of my heart. And then, I heard it. A faint SCHH thump. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the kitchen. I stood motionless, my entire body rigid with fear, every muscle screaming at me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The sound came again, closer this time. SCHH thump, SCHH thump. It was slow, deliberate, the distinct sound of wood scraping against wood. My mind, in a desperate attempt to find a logical explanation, tried to tell me it was just a neighbor, or maybe an animal. But I knew with a cold, certain dread that it was inside my apartment. It was moving my kitchen table. It was continuing the path. And it wasn't making any attempt to be quiet. It wanted me to know. It wanted me to hear my hands flew up to cover my mouth, muffling a choked sob. The SCHH thump was relentless, a metronome counting down to what? I didn't want to know. My body, finally jolted into action by a primal instinct for survival, took over. I took a shaky step backward, away from the path, away from the kitchen, towards the front door. The doorknob was cold and solid against my clammy palm, a lifeline to the world outside. I twisted it, and it turned with a quiet click. I didn't care about the key, about locking it behind me. I just wanted out. I pulled the door open, a sliver of light from the hallway spilling into the pitch-black abyss of my apartment. I didn't look back. I just ran. I ran like my life depended on it, down the 3 flights of stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete that I stumbled out onto the street, blinking against the relative brightness of the city lights and the street lamps that were now flickering back to life. I didn't stop until I was a few blocks away, standing under the dim glow of a lamppost, panting, my lungs burning, my entire body trembling. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I wanted to call someone, but who? How do you explain that your furniture was rearranged by an unseen entity in the dark? Would they even believe me? I spent the rest of the night walking the streets, a ghost in my own neighborhood, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. I was homeless, but not in the way you'd think. My home was there, a few blocks away, a physical place I could go back to, but I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that I could never set foot inside that apartment again. Not with that image of my own face waiting for me at the bedroom door. Not with the scraping sounds of something moving my world around in the dark. The next morning, with the sun finally up, I went back. The air was thick with a nervous, electric energy. I couldn't face it alone, so I called my best friend, Sarah. She thought I was just in a bad state from the blackout, but she came anyway. She was skeptical, of course, but her face paled when she saw the apartment. My furniture was indeed rearranged, exactly as I had seen it in that terrifying glimpse of light. The armchair in the hallway, the lamp by the floor, the path of pillows and coffee table. It was all there, a silent testament to a night of sheer terror. But there was something else. In the middle of the floor, where the path ended at the bedroom door, there was a small, perfectly neat pile of my hair. Just a few strands, neatly coiled up. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it got there. I never saw that photo of myself again, that I never went back to that apartment. Not to live, at least. Sarah helped me get my stuff out while I waited in the hallway, my heart pounding every time she disappeared inside. I never told my landlord why I was breaking my lease. I just paid the fees and walked away. My life is different now. I moved to a different city. I have a new job, a new apartment. But every time the lights flicker, every time a power outage happens, I feel that same suffocating fear, that same gut-wrenching dread. I still can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that apartment that night wasn't a human intruder. It was something else. Something that didn't want to steal from me. It wanted to play with me. It wanted me to follow its little breadcrumbs, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had. What was waiting for me at the end of that path? And more importantly, what was going to happen once I reached the end? The thought of it still keeps me awake at night. A silent, chilling question hanging in the dark. The road was a black ribbon unspooling under the glare of my headlights, a perfect slice of a quiet Tuesday night. It was late, pushing past 2 a.m., and I was on my way back to Portland after a 2-day photography gig in a small coastal town. My life back then was a mess of long drives and cheap motel rooms, fueled by too much coffee and the occasional adrenaline rush of a good shot. I loved the nights like this, the solitude of the open highway, the hum of the engine being the only constant sound for miles. It was just me, my beat-up '06 Honda Civic, and the endless stretch of asphalt. The moon was a faint sliver, and the stars were blotted out by a thick layer of cloud, so the only light for what felt like forever came from my car. It was a meditative kind of dark, the kind that lets you think and just be. I had no idea that the real darkness, the kind that swallows everything whole, was just a few miles ahead. Waiting for me to drive right into it, I was maybe 100 miles outside the city when it happened. One moment, the highway ahead of me was lit by the ghostly glow of the streetlights, a steady, rhythmic pulse of light. The next, it was gone. Just like that. Every single light vanished at the same exact time. I thought it was just a power grid failure, a minor inconvenience. But then my headlights died, and the dashboard went black. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. The car was a useless metal shell, coasting on inertia for a terrifying moment before grinding to a halt on the shoulder. The darkness that fell was so profound it felt physical, like a solid wall pressing in on all sides. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an active, consuming void. My heart started pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal, no battery, nothing. The quiet was the worst part. There wasn't a single cricket, no sound of the wind, just nothing. That's when I knew this was so much worse than a simple blackout. It was wrong. I sat there, paralyzed, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The silence was so perfect, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I told myself to calm down, that it was just a strange mechanical failure combined with a power outage. But the deeper I sank into the darkness, the more my rational brain screamed that this was wrong. That's when I heard it. A soft, gentle tap on the driver's side window. It was so light, I almost convinced myself it was a loose pebble from the car's momentum. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, this time on the passenger side. It wasn't the sound of rain or debris. It was deliberate, like someone was gently testing the glass, moving from one side to the other, slowly, rhythmically to my heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled my arms close to my chest, trying to make myself smaller in the vast darkness. The tapping continued, moving around the car, front to back, side to side. It was like I was in the middle of a sinister game of musical chairs, and the taps were the signal to move. That's when the whispers started. At first, it was just a faint, airy sound, like wind chimes in a far-off place. But then they solidified into words. My name. Sarah. Sarah. It wasn't just one voice, though. It was dozens of them, layered on top of each other, each one a different tone. Some were high and childlike, others low and gravelly. Some sounded like my own mother, and some were just a dry, sibilant hiss. They were all calling me at the same time, from every direction, right outside the car. My terror went from a cold dread to a boiling panic. I needed to see. I needed to know what was out there. I had to see. I reached for my phone, a useless brick moments ago, and flipped it open. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't for the screen to flicker to life. The battery icon was still dead, but a weak, unstable beam of light shot out from the flashlight app. It was barely enough to cut through the oppressive darkness, but it was enough. I pointed the trembling beam at the driver's side window. The light revealed a figure standing just inches away from the glass. And it wasn't alone. As I panned the light, I saw them all around the car. There were dozens of them, maybe more, standing in a circle, facing me. They were all the same height, the same skinny build, and they all had their hands raised, their long fingers gently tapping on the windows. My breath caught in my throat as the beam landed on one of their faces. It was my face, my features, my eyes, my lips, but pale and blank, a horrifying, empty reflection of myself that my mind shattered. I let out a choked gasp, pulling the light back into the car, trying to escape the sight of my own face staring back at me from every direction. The beam from the phone flickered violently, and in one final burst of light, the battery died. The darkness slammed back down, a physical weight that made me gasp for air. But the silence was different this time. The whispering stopped. The gentle tapping from the outside stopped too. For a brief, terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, I heard a sound right behind me. A light, rhythmic tap, tap, on the rear passenger window. My head snapped around. And then another tap, this time from the back of the driver's seat. It was coming from inside the car. The sound was so close it made my skin crawl, and I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that I was not alone anymore. Something was in the car with me, and it was reaching for me. I was frozen in pure, unadulterated terror. The tapping from the back seat was no longer a gentle sound. It was a rhythmic, hard thump, like knuckles on a headrest. I could feel the coldness of whatever it was seeping through the fabric of my seat. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to know what was in the car with me, not wanting to look at another version of my own face. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound, chilling silence, broken only by the tapping and my own choked breaths. I had to do something. I reached for the gear shift, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grasp it. I didn't care about starting the car. I just needed to move, to get out of the driver's seat. I fumbled for the lock on my door, but my fingers wouldn't work. The tapping was getting faster, moving closer to the driver's seat. It was a rapid-fire tap, 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 tap that was now on the dashboard, and then I felt a chilling breath on the back of my neck. So close I could almost feel the phantom lips forming my name. In a final, desperate act, I let out a guttural scream, a sound born of pure terror and primal fear, and threw my body to the side. At that exact moment, a blinding light flooded the car. The headlights flickered on, and the dashboard lights came back to life with a triumphant glow. The street lights on the highway ahead of me all lit up at once, a domino effect of light chasing away the darkness. The tapping stopped. The chill vanished. The car shuddered once, and the engine roared to life. I was completely alone. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the empty back seat. The highway behind me was a silent, empty stretch of asphalt. I jammed the car into drive and floored it, not caring about the speed limit. I just drove and drove and drove. The morning sun finally came up, turning the gray sky to a bruised purple and then a gentle orange. The world was normal again, but I wasn't. I don't know what it was that night, but I know that even now, whenever I'm in the dark, I can still hear that soft, rhythmic tap, tap, and I find myself checking the rearview mirror just in case.